Okay. The United States is guilty of the crime of overstepping the sovereignty of other nations by choosing to become the world's police. Their motives being the spreading of their political views, political containment, conquering of opposing political ideologies, imperialism, and retaliation. Because of these motivations and the role that the United States has forced itself into, Americans have sacrificed their safety, their quality of life, and have been forced into living in fear. Wait, does the other one go now? Do they like see that? Okay.
So starting with a quote from Robert E. Lee, "What a cruel thing war is, to fill our hearts with hatred instead of love for our neighbors." Starting with the war itself, the Spanish-American War was a war between the United States and Spain, lasting from April 21st, 1898 to August 13th, 1898. Despite the entirety of the war lasting within the span of less than a year, the origins of the war date back to the Cuban independence struggle, which began on February of 1895. The native Cuban people were fighting for their independence from Spain. This conflict was a threat to the United States investments in the island, prompting them to quell the rebellion. Native Cubans were collected into concentration camps near large cities, which many of them dying from starvation and exposure to disease. American media sources documented the situation, allowing widespread press coverage to spark sympathy from American citizens on the home front. The growing desire for intervention from the U.S. pushed Congress to declare war that belligerent rights should be put in place. However, then-current President Grover Cleveland ignored the proposition in interest of preserving peace with Spain. This sentiment was continued by Cleveland's successor, William McKinley. Both of these presidents did agree that avoidance of intervention could be changed if the conflict continued. On July 18, 1898, the government of Spain called for an end of hostilities, asking for France as a mediator to the dispute. As an armistice was signed on August 12, 1898, the argument declared that Spain must surrender all authority over to Cuba and give power over Puerto Rico to the United States. On December 10, 1898, the Treaty of Paris was signed. In total, the argument declared Spain would withdraw any power they held over Cuba, and the U.S. would be given over power of the Philippines, Puerto Rico, and Guam. The treaty faced opposition from the U.S. Senate, but was ultimately approved on February 6, 1899. The Spanish-American War demonstrated the United States overstepping their boundaries through many examples. First of all, the United States began involvement to protect their investments, not in the best interests of the Cuban people. Also, after the war had concluded, the United States occupied many islands as territory for trade and profit. This not only goes against the values that the U.S. fought for in its own war for independence, but also showed how the policing the U.S. would practice on these islands had motivations in economic gain. The white man's burden was also another key example of overreaching. The U.S. forced their customs of culture and society on the native people who never asked for them. This delusion was formed that the natives were ungrateful, when in reality they wanted to govern and maintain themselves without the involvement in the United States.
The troops that served in the Spanish War were poorly trained and supplied. They issued absolute weapons to the soldiers, they wore heavy wool uniforms that were unsuitable for Cuba's tropical climate, and they were given rotting, contaminated food to eat. 3,000 Americans died. Only 380 of them actually died in combat. The rest of them from malaria and yellow fever, along with other diseases. American leaders knew that the soldiers who served in the Spanish War were poorly trained, yet because they wanted the territory, they sent the soldiers anyway, and they gave them contaminated food, and
The new technologies forced both sides tactics and forced the two into a stalemate. This sparked new technologies to be created in an effort to break the stalemate and get a severe advantage over the other side. The Treaty of Paris, signed in December 1898, ended the Spanish-American War. Spain gives up the control of Cuba, Puerto Rico, and Guam, and sold the Philippines to the U.S. for $20 million. Taylor Amendment, it prevented the United States from taking possession over Cuba. However, it did not work for the Philippines. Believed that the United States must not give up the Philippines because it played a huge role in the trade with China. President McKinley also believed that Philippine people needed to be more educated. Anti-imperialists such as Mark Twain and William Bryan were against these government ideas, and soon it reached the citizens to painted demand for freedom.
In World War I, America was originally neutral because President Wilson wanted to keep the peace and be an example for other countries so democracy would spread. America had given loans to the Allied forces, which meant that if the Allies lost, the U.S. would probably wouldn't get their money back. America finally entered the war when the British admitted to the U.S. that they had no money and no troops left to win the war. America's main reason for joining the war was not only to help others, but to fight for democracy's sake. 4 million Americans entered the war despite the 3 million being needed to support the British and French. America joined the war because Wilson thought that we had a superior government that every country should use and that American soldiers should protect. In World War I, the technologies that were created, like the machine gun, rendered the old war tactics, like the cavalry and infantry, obsolete. About 15 to 19 million military deaths in World War I. 116,000 of them were American, with civilian and military casualties combined is estimated at 40 million. 1 in 10 of all fighting forces in the war were killed. It was the first conflict in World War history to have more deaths caused by combat rather than from diseases spread during fighting. The new technologies that were created during World War I ended with a stalemate between both sides, causing millions of soldiers and civilians to die.
The Pacific theater of World War II began on December 7, 1941. Japan decided to attack Pearl Harbor in the Hawaiian Islands owned by the United States. The United States declared war on Japan, which caused Japan's allies, Germany and Italy, to declare war on the United States.
On August 6, 1945, at around 8:16 a.m., the U.S. dropped the first ever atomic bomb on Hiroshima. 75,000 people were killed instantly in Hiroshima, and another 125,000 were killed from radiation or sickness from the bombing overall, killing around 200,000 people, which was about 90% of Hiroshima's population at the time. Later on, at 11:02 August 9, 1945, the U.S. dropped another atomic bomb on Nagasaki, which killed 40,000 instantly, and another 100,000 people were killed altogether. America is willing to kill thousands of civilians in order to win over an opposing side that had a different political view.
During the Cold War, the United States and the Soviet Union fought through many wars of proxy. These wars involved no direct military conflict between the U.S. and USSR, but instead usually involved each world power supporting an opposing side of a war in a third party country or countries. The two most prevalent examples of these conflicts were the Korean War and the Vietnam War. Both of these wars were fought with a line of latitude dividing the country into a northern segment and a southern segment. In the case of the Korean War, it eventually ended in a stalemate. An armistice was agreed upon, but the war has never officially ended to this day. In Vietnam, the war ended in a loss for the United States, with Vietnam now unified under a communist government. These conflicts all arose from the idea of containment. The United States believes that if one more Asian country fell to communism, a so-called domino effect would lead to the entire continent becoming communist. Some lesser-known examples include the Ogaden War between Ethiopia and Somalia, the Congo Crisis, and the secret war in Laos. Initially, before the beginning of the Ogaden War, the Ogaden region was disputed over by Ethiopia and Somalia, with Somalia being supported by the USSR and Ethiopia being supported by the US. However, when Somalia invaded Ethiopia without Soviet consent, the USSR stopped supporting Somalia and began supporting Ethiopia. With this being a war proxy, the US was forced to shift their support to Somalia. The war ended in Somalian defeat. During the Congo Crisis, a rebellion caused a split in the Congo, creating a rebellion called the People's Republic of Congo, supported by the USSR, and the government army supported by the United States. The war resulted in the collapse of the rebellion and the Congo being ruled by dictatorship until 1997. In Laos, the secret war was a conflict between the royal family supported by the U.S. and the Pathet Lao supported by the USSR. The war resulted in the royal family being overthrown and the establishment of the Lao People's Democratic Republic. During the Cold War, the United States demonstrated overstepping their boundaries through their rigorous political and military involvement in the conflict of isolated nations. The U.S. justified their involvement with their need for containment. The U.S. believed that if any Asian nation fell into communism or the Soviet Union, the entire continent would follow suit. This often led to the U.S. meddling with the Civil Wars, government disputes, and other conflicts of other nations. Their added military assets also escalated situations in some cases, creating a hostile conflict in an otherwise solely political or diplomatic dispute.
So after 9/11, on March 19, 2003, Bush announces the Operation Iraqi Freedom, and this was to get rid of Saddam Hussein and eliminate the ability to produce weapons of mass destruction. Bush claims that the war on Iraq was solely to get rid of Hussein, despite accusations made by other people claiming that the war was announced to acquire oil, or because of the attack on George H.W. Bush earlier, ordered by Hussein. December 15, 2003, the U.S. captured Hussein, and despite Bush announcing that the operation had been accomplished, Iraq still saw deadly attacks upon them, and 3,000 U.S. dead, while another 23,000 U.S. were wounded, and 50,000 or more Iraqi civilians were killed. And a quote by Edward Mays was, "Do not ever bring politics into war, period."
So moving more on to the home front now, starting with Spanish War. As Americans saw themselves as saviors of the Filipinos didn't appreciate Americans' help. They did not want us controlling them or looking over them, but yet we still overstepped our boundaries. There were many racist stereotypes about people in American territories. Americans saw themselves as saviors and that they were helping these people to become more civilized, and that they were saving them from their way of living, so cleaning themselves, or cleaning them.
President William McKinley used many different tactics to make Americans feel it was necessary to fight Spain, such as blaming Spain for the sinking of the battleship Maine and using guilt to make Americans feel bad for Cubans. They made the Cubans sound like they were suffering and in desperate need of America's help. In World War I, on the home front, roughly 4,400 soldiers came back from World War I without some or all parts of their limbs. Many people had to have feet amputated because of trench foot, and hundreds of others were permanently bedridden or in wheelchairs. Nearly 100,000 people were sidelined from the war with psychological injuries. The most common disabilities were shell shock, which is now known as PTSD, and that was caused by the horrors of the Great War. These people would suffer from these effects for the remainders of their lives. 116,708 American soldiers died in World War I.
Soldiers coming back from combat often dealt with their families not being able to understand what they were going through, because most of the soldiers couldn't communicate to their families about what happened on the battlefield.
In World War II, Britain imported 55 million tons of food. A month after the war had started, this figure dropped for 12 million. The government was worried that as food and other items become scarcer, prices would rise and poor people might not be able to afford things. There was also a danger that some people might hoard items, leaving none for others. Food wasn't the only thing rationed during World War II. Rationing books for clothing were also given out 2 years after food rationing had started. People were urged to make, do, and mend so that clothing factories and workers could be used to make items such as parachutes and uniforms needed in battle against Germany.
You have 1 minute.
Even events that took place in Eastern Europe led people to fear that democracy was losing and communism was winning.
During World War II, President Franklin Roosevelt established internment camps in America for Japanese people. This was considered one of the most outrageous acts in American civil rights history. Most of these people lived on the Pacific coast of the country. Around 110,000 to 120,000 were relocated into these camps on December 7, 1941. Just hours after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, the FBI rounded up to 1,291 Japanese community and religious leaders, arresting them without evidence and freezing their assets. And a quote by John Phillips: "I felt really bad about the young people who went to war and died young and didn't get a chance to live."
Okay, we're going to have to stop you there. Thank you, prosecution.
Yeah, I thought we were gonna project visuals.
Oh shoot, I totally forgot about that. My bad.